Hello, everyone. My name is Anna, and I'm 22 years old. My boyfriend Jackson tragically died in a motorcycle accident a few months ago, and of course, it was unbearably hard for me. But then I met somebody who resembled him so much that I started to doubt whether it was an accident at all. Once, I, as usual, took a bus to go home from work. I was staring through the window when I suddenly heard some guy talking on the phone. Suddenly, I realized that his voice sounded really familiar to me, and the intonation that he used and the way he laughed, oh my God, I felt as if I was hearing Jackson talking. I turned my head to look at the guy so sharply that even my neck began to hurt. He had the same hair and approximately the same body as Jackson had. Then he suddenly raised his hand and ruffled his hair. Something squeezed inside of me. Jackson always did the same thing when he was on the phone. I couldn't help but stare at that guy, and when at the next bus stop he left the bus, strangely for me, I decided to follow him. I was lucky that evening, and he never looked back, so I figured out his address. I couldn't help but notice that even his walk was exactly the same that my Jackson had. That night I couldn't fall asleep, and the next day I once again went to the building to see that guy again. I must admit, I almost stalked him for the next few days. I discovered that he drank the same latte with cinnamon that Jackson preferred. When he went jogging in a park, I was there hiding behind the bushes just to have an opportunity to see his resemblance to my love. This probably gave me a feeling that Jackson was still somewhere close to me. It seemed that I had become obsessed with this new hobby of mine. Let's call it that. One day, I lost him. He was walking down the street, being followed by me, and then he suddenly took a turn around a corner. I almost had to run to keep up with him, but then a whole crowd of people came toward me. I felt desperation and began looking around, but I couldn't find him anywhere. I got really upset and turned around to go home, when suddenly he appeared, as if out of nowhere, right in front of me. He was standing so close to me and looking straight into my eyes that I almost forgot how to breathe. He raised his eyebrows slightly and very seriously asked why I was following him, and I got confused and said that I had fallen in love with him. I felt that I'd started to turn red and wanted to get out of there as fast as I could. Apparently, he wanted to stop me by grabbing my hand, but he grabbed my purse instead. It broke, and everything that was inside fell on the ground. He started to apologize and help me to collect everything. Then we had a coffee in the nearest Starbucks, and by the end of that day, we were both looking at each other with undisguised attraction. So Julian and I began dating, and the closer we became, the more I realized how much he resembled Jackson to me, like the way he tied his laces in a double knot, for example. Although Julian knew that my previous boyfriend had died, I decided not to tell him anything about the resemblance. You see, I was afraid that he wouldn't like the fact itself. Besides, he once got angry that I was talking about my ex, so I myself enjoyed the fact that maybe the soul of my loved one had moved to the body of this attractive young man to stay with me. But then he invited me to have dinner at his apartment, where I found something that made me doubt that our meeting was accidental at all. While Julian was finishing cooking the main dish, I decided to set the table and opened one of the drawers in search of napkins. I came across a photo album, and I really got surprised that somebody still had something like this nowadays. So I started to look through it, and I suddenly saw a photo of Julian from like 5 years ago. He was standing in the foreground with a pruner in his hands, and the caption said that it was his first job ever. But my attention was focused on the house in the background, which looked extremely familiar. I went up with it to Julian, but he just kissed me shortly and invited me to start our meal. At home, I was supposed to finish some stuff for work, so I was sitting next to my laptop. But at the same time, I couldn't stop thinking about that house from Julian's photo album. My eyes fell on a folder where I kept photos of Jackson, and it suddenly hit me. I feverishly started to look through it, and there it was, one of the most recent selfies of Jackson and me in front of his parents' house when he took me there to meet them the first time. I'd been there only one single time, so it wasn't a surprise that I didn't recognize that place right away. But then why did Julian never move a muscle when I was telling him about Jackson? All of this seemed really suspicious to me, and the next day I called Jackson's mom. Of course, she was more than surprised when I asked her whether they had a gardener about 5 years ago. But then she recalled that indeed there was one summer when one of Jackson's classmates asked them to hire him to mow their lawn. He was from a difficult family, and it was clear that he was drawn to Jackson and even tried to imitate his behavior and his taste preferences. They weren't really close to each other, but Jackson has always been good with people. One day that gardener boy ruined their lawn and then just disappeared. Even though Jackson's mom wasn't sure about the name of that guy, it wasn't really necessary because I'd already taken my guess. As soon as I hung up the phone, I rushed to Julian's house. Rage was tearing me apart. How could he be keeping that from me? I banged on his door with such a force that even the neighbor peeked out from the opposite apartment to see what was happening. Julian was hanging some shelves, and when he let me in, he was still holding a hammer in his hand. I immediately grabbed the photo album, found that photo of his, and pointing at it with my finger, I angrily demanded that he explain why he didn't mention that he knew Jackson. I noticed that the corners of his lips twitched nervously. He made an attempt to hug me, but I pushed him away. He started saying that everything was just a coincidence, but I didn't want to believe him. I lost my nerve for a second and assumed that maybe he deliberately imitated Jackson to torture me, and that phrase turned out to be crucial. Julian turned red from anger. He threw the hammer into the wall behind me so hard that it made a hole in it and stuck out there. I screamed involuntarily and covered my head with my hands. We'd been together for several weeks, and I'd never noticed that he had any anger issues. Horror paralyzed me. Julian began to slowly approach me. He spoke, but his voice was barely detectable, and it was obvious that he felt extremely hurt. According to him, Jackson always had the best of everything. A perfect family, money, while Julian was raised by a single mom who had issues with alcohol. He thrust himself into gardening at Jackson's house just to earn some money. Julian had a girlfriend, and when he once invited her to hang out with him while he was working, Jackson began to flirt with her and eventually took her from him. Julian promised himself that he would get revenge. He followed his life through social networks, and that's how he learned about me. He set up the accident by releasing the dog under the wheels of Jackson's motorcycle in the hopes that he would remain disabled and I would leave him. But since he was now gone, Julian could rightfully take a part of his life, me, for himself. He specifically imitated even the smallest patterns of Jackson's behavior so that I became more attracted to him. He was standing so close to me that I felt the beat of his heart. I couldn't believe my ears. Everything that he said and did scared the heck out of me. I no longer needed explanations. All I wanted was to get out of his apartment. I rushed to the door, but he painfully grabbed my arm. His eyes were completely wild. We started a fight, and when I finally managed to escape, I jumped out of the apartment and ran downstairs. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed that Julian ran after me. The neighbor from the opposite apartment was taking her dog for a walk, and that was perfect for me because Julian bumped into her, and that gave me some time to lose him. I ran outside and rushed toward my house. I didn't know what exactly Julian would do with me if he caught up to me, and I really didn't want to find out. I ran across the street when I suddenly heard the screech of brakes from several cars and heard a dull blow. It was the scariest sound I've ever heard in my life. I looked back, and everything froze inside me. Julian was laying down in the middle of the roadway with the motorcyclist who must have hit him. I hesitated for a second, but then I rushed to see what had happened. The ambulance took both Julian and the motorcyclist to the hospital. I also went. I was sitting in the hall of the hospital thinking about what Julian had told me over and over again. I was so tired and emotionally devastated. Crowds of people walked past me while I was twisting my cell phone in my hands. Several times I tried to dial Jackson's mom's number to tell her everything that I had learned, but something stopped me. Soon I saw a doctor. He went up to a woman who, as I understood, was a relative of that motorcyclist. I didn't hear their conversation, but judging by her reaction, the guy was all right. And then someone touched my shoulder. It was a doctor who was fighting for Julian's life. He had also survived. It was strange, but with relief at that moment, I felt fear. What if he leaves the hospital and tries to get revenge on me? I called Jackson's mom and told her everything. I understand how nonsensical I might have sounded, but I'm grateful that she took me seriously. Together, we managed to send him on a retreat to a special clinic for mentally ill people. Months have passed since then, but I still keep thinking about how strange that road accident was. It was as if Jackson wanted to save me and sent that motorcyclist to stop Julian.